Nature of Society Part 2 Session 9R. Rights cannot be enjoyed unless duties are fulfilled. This we have stressed over the past two sessions. Freedoms are enjoyed in this country, laws, customs, and traditions are observed because duties are clearly acknowledged and maintained. From the head of state to the ordinary man in the street, all are subject to law. All must fulfill duties to the society. No one is allowed to molest, injure, or imprison another, except acting with the sanction of the law. No one is permitted without lawful excuse to defame another. Subject to this, all may speak and act freely and without fear. People may meet and congregate as they please. All these may take place once fundamental duties common to all are observed by all. These duties are in the main observed where political and social freedoms are concerned. When it comes to economic duties to one another, it is an entirely different matter. Where these matters are concerned, rights and duties regarding private property are non-existent. Short of ownership of human beings, which was abolished in the early 19th century, it is all about privilege where economic rights and duties are concerned. We have actively denied the notion that every able-bodied man should live by his own labor. We have honored and exalted those who have lived by the toil of others. Although we have abolished and abhorred slavery, society has subtly or tacitly considered some human beings as mere utensils for use and even enjoyment for others. This failure to recognize economic duties has rendered economic rights non-existent. As a result of this, the majority of workers are engaged in a struggle for existence in which the privileged, the strong, and the unscrupulous seem to do very well. When this situation proceeds, the government is changed by ballot, but the incoming regime, though very confident that they can improve the economic plight of their many, have no notion of the true causes, and the cycle repeats itself. It is therefore of major importance to consider the economic duties that all men have to each other, what the consequences of this denial will be, and how these duties can be enforced. We will first consider the economic rights to wages. Men work in order to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Men build shelters and sow crops to house and feed themselves and their dependents. There is no greater disappointment for a man being denied the fruit of his efforts. It is for this reason that tenants do not improve the lands that are leased to them, in fear that the landlord will reclaim it and obtain all the improvements made to it. A man needs security of tenure of his holdings to enable the reaping of the full reward of his labor. This has led him to believe that private property in land is the only way this security can be provided. But we have seen what the impact of enclosing the land has been. The private ownership of land, far from securing men the full reward of their labor, results in the degradation of laborers to a position of dependency and poverty. Private ownership of land, entailing as it must the private collection of rent, takes from the community that which the community has created and which belongs to it. Those who own the land dictate terms to the rest of the community. These landowners will naturally seek to obtain as much as possible in return for the use of their landholdings. They will not offer long-term leases for fear that they will not be able to recoup the increasing rental values as they advance. Security of tenure, therefore, is the exception rather than the rule, and no tenant will make improvements because of his short-term tenure. Between the landlord and tenant, there is not much commonality of interest. The landlord cares for nothing more than the collection of his rent, He, for instance, has no knowledge of the business of the tenant. The tenant sees the property as a precious asset which he would readily make improvements to if he had security of tenure and if the eventuality of increased rent did not arise as a result of these improvements. It is ironic that most workers build houses for others to live in and sow crops so that others may eat. However, they themselves are ill-housed and ill-fed. The state has no better right than anyone else to enclose land as state lands. The state and all its servants and agents have the same duty to all citizens as citizens are to the state. The citizen who is excluded from access to land will not be less excluded because the state excludes him. The state has no better right than anyone else to ignore the duties all owe to one another. The public right can only be enforced with respect to land if workers' rights to wages are acknowledged and protected. Simply to make the state the controller of lands and to permit the state to exercise all the rights of a full owner will not provide the security of tenure as desired by the laborer. The state would now have a life and death control over the worker, and their position would be no different than if it was a private landlord. Imagine the control that politicians would have over workers if tenure was under authority of governments. For true freedom to be enjoyed or the fruit of one's labor to be had, the control of land should neither be public nor private. The state's duty should not only be to enforce the duties that each citizen has to the community, but to also secure the rights of individuals by enforcing the duties of individuals to each other. The lack of enforcement of these duties by the state has resulted in the rental values from sites going into private hands instead of the treasury. The government then must look elsewhere for its revenue, and it comes primarily from wages through PAYE. To the extent that the rental value is not reclaimed, revenue is from wages, and this robs the laborer of his natural reward. We stated last term what the canons of good taxation were. To recall, they were: taxation should bear as lightly as possible on industry. Taxation should bear equally on all. Taxation should be easy to assess and collect. Taxation should be paid for by the person on whom it is levied. Taxation should be certain in amount. When we return, we will look at what the current impact of taxation is in relation to these canons. What are the impact of the current tax regime in relation to the canons of good taxation? In relation to the first canon, taxation should bear as lightly as possible on industry. We can all agree that current taxation policy acts as a disincentive to production, both corporate as well as individual. Evidence of this is in the amount of tax evasion that exists in the society. Taxation should bear equally on all. Taxation does not bear equally on the landowner as it does on the entrepreneur or worker. It is clear that the poor is levied with far greater impact than the rich, who in most instances can avoid a large percentage of it. Taxation should be easy to assess and collect. Assessment and collection of taxes not only involve an army of tax personnel, which is very expensive, but with the high degree of tax avoidance and evasion, the exercise is not a viable one. Have a look at the operations of your Inland Revenue Department. the Valuation Department, and the Customs and Excise Department, and see the tremendous resources that are utilized to gather taxes that in most instances fall short of the budgeted. Taxation should be paid by the person upon whom it is levied. It is no secret that all so-called direct taxes are passed on to the consumer in the price of goods and services. Rates levied on productions find its way at every stage of the process. The ultimate purchaser pays not one levy, but multiple levies. He also pays the landlord's property tax, motor licenses, petrol taxes, stamp duties, and all other impositions on industry. In this way, the ordinary worker's wages are reduced to the extent of the levies imposed. Taxation should be certain in amount. Taxes are based on the amount of profit accrued and the amount of wages earned. If these fluctuate, then the taxes fluctuate similarly. If the taxes imposed were in certain amounts that the businesses can plan for, then this could be for their benefit, as they could then set production targets to meet these obligations, with all further production tax-free. With the regime where rental values are taken by the state for revenue, how would the canons of good taxation stack up here? First of all, the true rental value of land is no more difficult than the rates that are assessed on buildings. It is also cheaper and is more accurate than valuations. The valuator of sites would simply need to find out what a particular site is valued at without the buildings and improvements upon it. The result would be that the sites would not be overvalued because of their improvement or devalued because of dilapidated structures upon them. The valuator would be concerned with the value of the site itself and not the use to which it is put. Taxation should bear as lightly as possible on industry. Taking the rental value from landholders cannot hamper industry at all. The rent represents the advantage they gain from the work of others. The landholder is not deprived of any part of his produce due to his own skill or industry. Far from imposing a burden on industry, this measure would encourage it. No one would be able to hold land idle, as they would have to put it to use to meet his economic duty to society, or give it up. The result would be that lands would now become freely available rather than be enclosed. Because of this, industries would move to lands best suited for their particular purposes. Rent would not vary with the amount of production taking place on site. No longer will there be the situation where taxes are imposed based on the amount of production taking place. Taxation should bear equally on all. Every member of society has an equal right and share to the rent. This rent is to be shared equally amongst all citizens. Taxation should be easy to assess and collect. No man can hide land. The landholder can easily be identified. The value of land is also easy to assess, and a regular assessment of it could be done easily. Taxation should be paid by the person to whom it is levied. In this regime, the landholder could not pass the rent on to others. The effect of taking the rent will bring production to a minimum. The increased flow of goods onto the market and the readiness with which new trade could be launched would prevent prices from escalating. Any attempt by a landowner to pass the rent on to others would be mitigated by the fact that all men could obtain sites on terms that are similar to those that the landholder obtained his. Speculation would disappear. Taxation should be certain in amount. Valuations of rental value would yield certain amounts on an annual basis. This signal that landholders would allow them to plan for the payment of this duty, beyond which all production could be tax-free. The non-observance of economic duties results not merely in taxation which reduces laborers' meager wages. It brings about an imbalance in the economy, where men are permitted to keep rental value for themselves. Not surprisingly, they will seek to acquire as much land as possible for speculative purposes. Entrepreneurs would also acquire as much land as to prevent competitors from gaining access to it. Both these activities inflate the price of land significantly, and less privileged citizens are deprived access to land. These less privileged persons have nothing but their labor to offer, and are reduced to dependence on those who are willing to employ them. The continuous competition between workers for employment will necessarily keep wages low, and this low wage will not allow them to purchase adequate housing and clothing, to send their children to fine schools, to pay for the best doctors, lawyers, and to live a comfortable life. Consequently, upon the laborer's inability to lead an adequate existence, government will devise ways to alleviate this poverty. This will be in the form of pensions, unemployment insurance, health insurance, tax-maintained hospitals and clinics, and other family allowances. This will cost money, which will be derived from taxes. If the laborer received this wealth and these services in wages, there will be no need for this charity. If he produced in proportion to his endeavor, if he could earn for himself as his own master in a fully equipped industry on the best land to be had for free, he could pay his way for these services. Before we end, I would like again to let you attendees know that Unsustainable Development is an educational offering devoted to the dissemination of its course to all of mankind, and to those who have the English language as their official language in the first instance, and to all eventually all over the world. To make this possible, and because we do not charge a fee for this dissemination, we rely wholeheartedly on monetary donations to meet the cost of achieving these goals. If you have found these sessions useful thus far and would like others to have access to them, we would gratefully accept your donations should you be inclined to offer them. You can send donations to our PayPal account at the email address nigelgittins@gmail.com. Thank you for your kind gesture.